Hey guys, I'm Anders here with Adam Audio, and today we're going to be talking about 10 commonly asked questions when it comes to studio acoustics. So today we're joined by Graham of Music City Acoustics here in Nashville. Graham, could you kind of give a backstory to where you started in the audio world and how you came to have this company and where you are now?
Yeah, so I started out, my background's in engineering and producing. Before that I was playing drums in a bunch of different bands and came to Nashville, interned at a studio, got more into the record making side of things and ended up putting together a couple of studios for myself to work out of. And through that got really into the acoustic side of things. A lot of acoustic treatments were really expensive and hard to find. You had to ship them, and so I ended up building everything. And several iterations of the studios later, figured out how to build them and make them well, and then started building them for other people, and then it just kind of turned into a company. And now I spend most of my time designing and consulting and building acoustic treatments for other studios.
So today's video is going to be about 10 commonly asked questions when it comes to studio design and acoustics and things like that. And so the first one on the list is, do acoustic panels help with soundproofing?
No, they don't. Acoustic panels are designed to help you control the sound within a space. So if there's like a really long reverb time and you want to cut down on that or cut down on reflections. If you're trying to soundproof something, you need to build a structure that one, sound can't leak through. So if you have a door or an opening, sound anywhere that light can get through, sound can get through. And so if you're soundproofing, you really have to build a barrier that has a lot of mass. And insulation isn't that heavy. That's the most commonly thing used in an acoustic panel. The other issue that they can't address is that soundproofing or isolating one room from another is dealing with vibrations traveling through a physical structure. So whether that's a wall or the floor or the ceiling, acoustic panels aren't going to absorb all of the energy in that room. So any of that energy that hits the floor before it ever hits a panel is now traveling through the floor, not through the air. The easiest way to think about that is just acoustic panels are going to help you treat sound or that energy that's traveling through the air in your room. But as soon as it comes into contact with one of the boundaries, so the floor, ceiling, or the walls, it's now traveling through that structure, and your acoustic panels don't have the ability to help you control that at all.
So the second question is, if someone walks into a room, how do they know what might be the best listening position, or how should they orient the room from the very get-go?
Yeah, so the biggest factor in that typically is your length and your width. Almost always you're gonna want to have the length of your room be the dimension that your speakers are firing down. That way you have a longer distance between the listening position and the rear wall, which will help limit some of those reflections that are gonna cancel out in your lower frequencies. As far as how you would go about figuring that out, the easiest and most practical and the best way to do it is really just to set up your speakers and listen. And then if you can do that in a fairly methodical way, so keeping track of like where in the room the speakers are, how far away are they from that front wall, and then where are you at the listening position, and you can move those independently and then also move each of them. And so you just kind of go through a series of listening tests to see where things are going to work the best. As you pull your speakers away from that front wall, you're going to run into some issues with cancellation in the low frequencies as soon as you're like a foot or two away from that wall. So the closer you get them, you'll help reduce those cancellations from SBIR reflections, but you're gonna then load that speaker up and get a little bit of boost in the lower range of that speaker that it can produce. That can be a really good thing depending on the room, or it can cause some other problems. So the best thing you can do is really listen. If we're tuning a room, we take a lot of measurements, and they can be really helpful, but it doesn't in any way alleviate the need to just sit there and listen and see what things sound like.
Do you follow like the rule of thirds by any chance or anything like that, or is it just kind of depends on the room?
For most rooms, kind of start out with somewhere in like the 38% range from the front wall. It's normally a good starting point. You can also go through and figure out where your room modes are gonna fall and try to avoid sitting in the nulls of those, and then try to avoid putting your speakers in the nulls of those. Both of those things can mathematically be very helpful and provide you with a good starting point, but if you treat a room, you can fairly quickly run into physical limitations, particularly in like a smaller home studio, home mixed room setup, that sort of makes it where it's just not that practical. And at that point, it's just sort of finding where do things sound the best, where does it feel good, and where does it translate. So we generally kind of start with that. The angle of the speakers, whether it's 30% or a little less, varies kind of from room to room. We don't have any like hard and fast rules with it, but they're definitely good starting points to have.
And that kind of brings us to our next question, question 3, which is what are room modes, and what are the negative effects of them, and how can you treat those?
Yeah, so room modes are frequencies that, based off of the dimensions of your room, will, as your speaker plays, basically start to ring out. So you think about like your room is a pipe. If you're blowing into, or like a Coke bottle, if you blow into that bottle, it'll make a pitch. And if you drink a little bit of the Coke that's in that bottle, that pitch is gonna go down. Depending on the length of your room, there's gonna be a frequency that has the same wavelength of your room. And as your speaker's playing that frequency, the room's gonna excite and it'll start to ring out. And that will happen for the length of your room, the width of your room, the height of your room, and then those will also start to interact with each other. And so what ends up happening is those notes or those frequencies have really long decay times in relation to the other frequencies that you're hearing. And when we're listening back to music, or if we're monitoring anything in a studio setting, we want things that have a really even decay, so that you don't feel like you always have to EQ out a certain frequency. So like if C, which is like right around 130, 140 hertz, C and B, if you're working on an acoustic guitar and you have an 8-foot ceiling, there's a very good chance it's gonna be very loud if you don't have a cloud above you. Just because of the floor to ceiling room mode, and that's gonna really put a lot of pressure and energy right at like your head height. And so you're just constantly gonna feel like you have to notch out 130 or 140 hertz in that guitar. And that's your room just making these things really loud and interacting with what you're supposed to be hearing from your speakers, which would hopefully you wouldn't be hearing the room. So they cause a lot of problems just in long decay times, and then also really big peaks and dips in amplitude throughout the room. So it causes inconsistencies. Other issue with that is that as you get like higher up into the frequency spectrum, so like 400 hertz and higher, you have a ton of room modes. So they all are like right next to each other. But in your lower frequencies, they're really spread out. So instead of being like this far apart and on top of each other, now they're like this far apart in frequency. So you may have one at 50 hertz and you don't have another one for 80 hertz. So you have these two frequencies that are gonna be really loud at certain points in your room and really quiet in other parts of your room, and everything else is just gonna be kind of normal. And what we're really striving for is to keep everything as even and flat within reason as possible.
So we talked about room modes and how much low end can be a negative issue in a lot of people's rooms. So what can you do to kind of combat the low end in your studio space?
So the main thing that you can do to help fight that and even out your low end response is implementing bass traps into the space. Bass traps aren't really one identifiable thing in the acoustics world. You can do a Google search for acoustic or for bass traps and you're gonna come up with all sorts of different things. Ultimately what it is something that is sort of specifically oriented towards helping you absorb lower frequencies. In order to do that effectively, if it's a porous absorber, so like your typical panel type thing, it's gonna be something that's at least 6.5 inches deep. And that's kind of just your starting point. So if you have a 6.5 inch deep acoustic panel, that can be a pretty effective absorber in the lower frequencies, but it's gonna need a lot of air behind it. So like in these corners here, we have 6.5 inch deep panels, but there's 2+ feet of air behind them, depending on where they are on the angle that you're measuring there. But so that air gap's really helping to push them off the wall. If you're not using a porous absorber, something more like a membrane trap that you can tune, those you can put right up against the wall, and they actually need to be, because those are acting off of the pressure in the room. So at any of those boundaries of the walls, you have a lot of pressure, but zero velocity. And any porous absorber, so an acoustic panel that has Owens Corning 703 or mineral wool, or anything like that, any kind of insulation, those are all working off of air particles moving, but they don't move up against the air. So if you think of like a car running into a brick wall or a concrete wall, that car could be going 70 miles an hour right up until it gets to that wall. And then it stops moving. And then you have a ton of pressure and it all folds on top of itself, but there's no movement anymore. And it's the same thing with sound. So like the closer it gets to those walls, the less those air particles are moving and your panels can't do anything. The material has the ability to absorb low frequencies well, but it can't do it if they're not moving. Membrane traps work in the exact opposite way, where they need all of the pressure that builds up. And then you have things like Helmholtz resonators. There's active bass traps now, which is a whole other world, but basically using software and DSP to help counteract things that are happening in the room. But the simple answer is that bass traps are really just anything that help you absorb low frequencies.
So we kind of touched on this next question already, but how do you install acoustic panels from the get-go? Like, what is the importance of leaving the air gap?
You know, where you install the panels, both within the room and whether or not they're flush up against the wall or how they have an air gap behind them, is going to hugely affect how effective they are. So the most common thing is like, how do you find an early reflection point in your room and treat those? And that's definitely the most critical area to treat, because you're going to limit reflections off those walls. Anytime you have a sound that's coming from your speaker and then going to you at the listening position, if that sound is also reflecting off a wall and then coming back to that listening position, the delay that it takes to bounce off of something and then come back to you is going to cause weird shifts in the frequency response. So putting panels there is definitely important. There's a lot of, you can use the mirror trick. There's plenty of pretty easy ways to find early reflections. So putting them there is awesome. The next biggest thing is how you actually put them up. And that mostly means that you typically don't want to put an acoustic panel right up against the wall. Same thing with bass traps, where they need that air behind them, even for like your mid frequency. So anything below 500 hertz, if you want the 2-inch thick panel to work well, it needs to have at least 2 inches of air behind them. In this room, all of these panels are 6 inches off of the wall. Yeah. And they're all 4.5 or 6.5 inches deep. Because if you're dealing with music, a 2-inch deep panel just isn't gonna be that effective in your mid and low mid frequencies. Yeah. It'll do a lot depending on the location, and if you have enough air behind it, or depending on like your focus, there's definitely some places for them, but using deeper panels with air behind them is really what you have to do from an installation standpoint to make them be effective. Yeah. And that applies to like wall panels, definitely anything that you're dealing with at corners, and then ceiling clouds as well. So
we are to number 6, and that is just, what is the best placement when it comes to your studio monitors? Do you put them on a stand like you have, or should you put them on a desk? Does it matter as much as people say it does?
It definitely matters. Whenever possible, put your studio monitors on stands, both from the standpoint of reducing some of the reflections that you might have off of your desk that are going to cause some cancellations in your mid frequencies. Most common thing in pretty much every studio is having like a big dip at 500 or 600 hertz off of the desk. You can limit that a little bit if you put them on stands, but more importantly, you have way more control about where your monitors go in the room. The most crucial thing in any listening environment is where's the listening position and where are your speakers, and that relation to one another and the relation to the room. So if you put your speakers on a desk, you're gonna be very fixed in both where you are in relation to your speakers and then where they can actually go in the room. So stands are hugely important, and really the only way that you can like kind of fine tune what you're hearing. Yep. And really improve the room through placement.
Question number 7 is about a completely different type of monitor, your computer monitor. A lot of people, I don't know if they realize how much of a difference that can make when it comes to the sound in your studio, but what have you noticed in your years of work?
Yeah, so this is one of probably the easiest ways to pretty drastically improve your monitoring. Kind of similar to putting your monitors or your speakers on your desk, and then if you then put your computer monitor on your desk, that typically puts the computer monitor pretty close to your face and in between, both physically in between the speakers, so like in the center of them, but also normally in front of them. And then so you just have this massive thing that's both reflecting sound in all sorts of weird ways to you, but is also blocking a lot of the direct sound for those higher frequencies from your monitors. Yeah. And it just sort of destroys your stereo image, really limits the depth of field that you're gonna hear, and then can do some pretty weird things all the way down in like the low mid frequencies. And it's an easy thing to fix in that if you just push your computer monitor or get a bigger auxiliary monitor so that it's further away and behind your speakers, you'll fix all those problems pretty instantly. That can be tough in that like maybe you can't mount your computer on the wall or something. Like that computer monitor is on a stand that's like $40 from Amazon. So it's just like a computer monitor with a Visa mount. Yep. Makes it super easy. That way, if you do have acoustic panels or treatment on that front wall, you don't have to mount your computer monitor to the panels themselves, and it'll make your monitoring way better.
So we are to question number 8, and this is about the decay time in your studio. What are some ways that you make the studio not completely dead in your designs?
We try to incorporate scattering, for a small room, like diffusion is going to be kind of a tough thing to really incorporate well. Diffusion takes a decent amount of space to be really effective, but you can use scattering in kind of specific places so that you still hear reflections in the room. Because if you just took a room and put acoustic panels up everywhere, your decay time is going to be way too low. And what that basically means is that your brain's going to have a really hard time interpreting, like, one, just where it is. Even if you're not working, it's a very uncomfortable space to be in if something doesn't have any reflections. So that leads to you being really tired and getting fatigued really quickly while you are trying to work. So while you don't want to necessarily hear the reflections off of the walls in your studio, you do need a way to treat them, but also have some sort of sound bouncing around in that room in some area. So we use scattering, like I said, and one of the ways to do that is just kind of putting slotted wood panels up on top of acoustic panels so that you get a little bit of reflections in the room that are also kind of breaking up and scattering the sound waves and energy that is hitting them while also absorbing a lot of that energy. We also have, like, in this case, a space coupler diffuser up above the desk, which helps just kind of improves the way that the cloud actually works. So it's increasing the surface area and all the different ways that things are hitting it. And then also creating a better just sense of space and openness at the desk itself. And all that kind of leads up to, one, being able to have a lot of absorption in here, which allows us to cut down a lot of just the initial problems that you'd have, but then also make it a pretty comfortable space to work on the more like math and sciencey side of that. Typically for a control room or a mixed room, that kind of thing, you want a decay time that's like 200 milliseconds or less, especially if they're like on the smaller side. So and that's like anything less than 20 by 25 feet. So with that, like, you're pretty quickly going to run out of room, if you have panels everywhere, your decay time is going to be like 100 milliseconds. So you're going to be way too short. You're going to have such a hard time working in there. But you also need the panel. So it's just sort of like, how do you incorporate both? And just kind of choosing the right places to put scattering and finding reflective areas so they're not necessarily like really causing any real issues with the listening position, but also creating a sense of space in the room. And
so, talked a little bit about diffusion already, but when do you use diffusion and when do you not?
Yeah, so diffusion can be awesome and very powerful. With that though, it needs quite a bit of space. It's like in this room that we're in right now, it's 11 feet long. That's not right. It's 11 feet wide and 14 feet long. And it's just not really a big enough room to put in like a true QRD or primitive root diffuser on that back wall, which is where you'd probably most commonly see it. For a couple of reasons. One, we need a lot of absorption on that back wall. The monitors in here are shooting pretty much straight at it, and that means there's gonna be a lot of reflections coming back off that wall, right back to the listening position. And as we talked about earlier, that's gonna cause a lot of problems in low frequencies. So there's gonna be like a pretty bad dip without absorption on that wall, or a very bad dip without absorption in the wall, from like 85 to 110 hertz, kind of that range. If we put a diffuser on there and we wanted it to be effective down to 800 hertz or so, it's gonna have to be like 9 inches deep. And then if we also need a foot of absorption on that wall, now we've got almost 2 feet of the back wall that's lost, and the room's only 14 feet to begin with.
So it's more of a physical space.
So there's just a lot of limitations to physical space, and then also just how much space the diffuser needs to really work well. If it could be flat on that wall, it would be pretty effective. Like if you can get 8 feet away from it or so, typically they'll say like 6 feet and it'll still work. It's not like you don't have any benefit to it, but to like truly get the full effect of it, you want probably a good 8 feet between you and the diffuser. We did a room last year, but it was 30 feet long, and we built a 2 foot deep bass trap on the back wall. So right in the middle of that, it has a beautiful big QRD diffuser, and it made a world of difference in that room, but there's plenty of space for it. There's still plenty of trapping behind that. So just kind of finding the right time and the right place to incorporate it.
And what do you think is the minimum sort of room size that you would want to incorporate a large diffuser like that? Minimum room length, I guess.
If your room's if you have a 17, 20 foot long room, you can definitely do it. It depends a lot on both the room length, but also if it's a pre-existing room, so something that's not being built, you can very quickly run into issues with like doors. Or closets or windows, whatever it is that may impede your ability to actually incorporate that well. So those also be factors. But if you have if your room's that long, you could probably pretty effectively do it. But it just means that like even in a room that's 20 feet long, you still need a good amount of space on that back wall for the absorption before you ever get to your diffuser. So if you have a door that like opens to that wall, your door won't be able to open. Or anything like that, windows. So probably 20 feet, I guess, ballpark. And if it's a tracking room or space that's not just solely used as like a control room or production room, that may vary a little bit. In that case, you don't need all of the low end absorption and kind of the bass trapping that you're going for. So if it's a multi-use space or anything like that, some of those things may change.
And I actually had that question too, is kind of what was your approach? How is it different from when you're doing a control room versus when you're doing a large live room? Like how much different is the approach that you guys take to treating it? So like large live, it depends on what will primarily be tracked. But if you take something like a drum set, there's still a ton of amplitude and energy and low frequency information there. So it's not like you can all of a sudden just start trying to control the decay of the room in the high and mid frequencies. Some of those same principles still apply. You still want a pretty even sounding room, but it can be a lot longer in its decay time. So you may not need as much absorption. Kind of depends on how far you really want to push that. You can get, I would say you can get away with a lot more in a live room. And by getting away with a lot more, I mean like doing a lot less. You can make a lot of really good sounding space without going crazy. Whereas like in a control room, you really have to do as much as you can if you want to make it accurate. So there's definitely a balancing act there. It's sort of like, what's the most important thing from like a budget standpoint and how do you incorporate all that? I'd be much more inclined to put a lot of diffusers in a live room than I would in a control room for sure. And incorporating those in different ways of like, you're still gonna want low frequency absorption, but it's not gonna be quite as crucial. So we are to our final question, which is how do you set up your monitors? Everything from measuring the listening position to leveling and all that stuff. So once we have, as we talked about earlier, kind of gone through and listened, set up the speakers, adjust the listening position, have that marked out, then we'll go through kind of the fine tuning process of actually positioning them and making sure everything is really accurate. And that can be a tricky thing to do because if you have two speakers just in your room, there's no real reference point a lot of time, particularly if there's already treatment in there to measure off of and make sure things are really accurate. And pretty much everybody toes in their monitors. But how do you accurately how do you make sure that you're angling them the same degree or that they're the exact same distance from the listening position? So we've kind of come up with a process to hopefully simplify that. It certainly simplifies it for us because we set up a ton of rooms and like, how do we quickly and easily make adjustments to that? So most of what we've kind of come up with isn't super different from what anybody else does. It's more so just geared towards how can we make it really easy to adjust things and make it repeatable and kind of faster so that we're not, the biggest thing is like you have two monitors here, two speakers, and you're trying to angle them in the same distance from the listening position. That can be a little tricky when they're just floating there in space in your room. So typically we're setting up a room, the first thing we'll do is set up lines on the floor so that we have things marked out and that we know, even if we block off a bunch of the walls and we can't measure things, that we know, in increments of 1 foot, in this case on the floor, our distance from the front wall. And then we have the middle line marked out because you're always gonna be sitting in the middle of your room. So the distance between the left wall and the right wall should be identical from, from the listening position so that everything's symmetrical. We can use those lines. And then what we do typically is we put up a board, so like a 2x4 that we'll put up in front of our monitors. And then we can use this to square up to the room. So this is parallel to that front wall. And then from that, we can use an angle finder. So something like this, just an adjustable angle finder. We can set it to the angle we want. So commonly that's 30 degrees. In some rooms, it's gonna be a little bit less. Very rarely do we ever really do anything higher than that, but it can happen if you're in a really tight, small area, potentially. And so we can use this, what will happen is we'll go on the other side of the board, use it to adjust and make sure everything is at the correct angle with our monitor. And now instead of,
trying to use string and a protractor or measure two different points on the top of your monitor, you have a very fixed position in the room, so that we have kind of this plane that's on the same plane as the room itself, so we can angle everything really accurately and easily. And then if we do need to move these, we just move this. The only thing that you really have to do to set this up is measure, from the front wall to 2 points on this board, so that you know that it's the same. So if this is 30 inches from that wall and that's 30 inches from that wall, it's going to be straight. If you don't have access to that wall, so like if these were both angled in further, that's when we would start to use the lines on the floor. So from there, then we can angle both of those monitors. Like I was saying, the only other thing that we typically do is use something to mark the middle point of the room. That's a little bit of a more fine point than, say, your head. And so in this case, on the blue tape, I have marked out already where the base of this mic stand should go to put this stand right in the middle of the room.
So if you count the lines of tape, we're about 5.5 feet from the front wall.
So the mic itself, is pretty much 5'6" or so from that front wall. And it's marked out there, super easy. So once we check the angle on both of these monitors, which we're shooting for 30 degrees in this case, we will make sure that they're the same, the monitors are the same distance from the listening position, and then everything will be lined up and ready to go. And this one's sitting perfectly at 30 degrees already. So I'll give that over to you. And the only thing that you really want to make sure you do here is use the flat part of your speaker. So most monitors are like these are going to have an angled portion of that. You want to make sure that you're not referencing that, so that you have a solid reference from the piece of wood or the 2x4 onto the flat part of your monitor.
Cool. Yeah, we're about exactly at 30 degrees as well.
So before we check our distance from the listening position, we just want to make sure that these are also the same distance from our sidewalls. You can use this board to mark that out. We can also, in this case, access the sidewall, because there's this little space between these corner bass traps and the panels here. So this one is right at 40 inches. And then just make sure that that is the same. And then we'll know in the room that the monitors are the same distance from the sidewalls and at the exact same angle.
Yep, about exactly 40.
Perfect. So the last thing to check is just gonna be distance from this microphone. And you can use any microphone. This is just the mic that we typically use when we're taking room measurements. When we're doing this, we use this laser because it's super fast and easy and it's very accurate, but you can just as well use a tape measure. Just make sure that you don't touch the tweeter with the tape measure.
Yeah, it sucks. Right
so if you're doing that, kind of similarly to where I'm angling this laser or pointing this laser is where you'd want to put the tape measure, so you're not going to damage your monitors at all. So in this case, we are 3 foot 10 inches to each monitor. And these are within a 16th of an inch of each other. So at this point, I'd probably make like one last very fine adjustment to like just barely nudging that monitor forward and then call that good. Just because they're so similar at this point, really shooting for that last 32nd of an inch isn't going to help you that much. These monitors are a little bit wider currently from tweeter to tweeter than they are from listening position to tweeter. And it's kind of one of those things that changes from room to room. So, as you're doing those initial listening tests, using the math kind of like we talked about beforehand as a good starting point is great, but I wouldn't say like you have to stick to this one thing. Because if it sounds better here, that's awesome, and that's definitely where it should be. And so if that works out to be within that like common equilateral triangle for the listening position, killer. And if it doesn't, totally fine. In this case, it's just like a little bit wider. And we may find that now that we've really fine-tuned everything, we want to angle those speakers a little bit less. So bring that down to like 27 degrees or so. Just do another listening test and make sure that everything's really where we want it. And then if so, we'll take all this out of here and just start making music.
Where can people find out more about Music City Acoustics and what you do?
Yeah, so our website is just musiccityacoustics.com. You can find pretty much everything that we make. All of our consulting and design work and all the information about that is up there. You can reach us through the website as well. And on our Instagram page, we've got bunch of pictures of stuff we worked on, that kind of thing. Most of our stuff's up there as well.
If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments below and we'll make sure to answer them as soon as we can. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time.